under the supervision of Professor Habib. So Patrick will talk about exploring the impacts of COVID-19 on modality styles for non-mandatory trips in the GTA. Patrick earned his master's and bachelor from UFT as well, and his research primarily focused on travel demand modeling and studying the impacts of emerging modes of mobility. So without further ado, I will keep the floor for Patrick to tell us more about the study.
All right, thanks, Al. Yeah, so as Ala mentioned, today we're talking to you about the study we did to explore the impacts of the pandemic on modality styles, specifically for non-mandatory trips amongst GTA residents. As you can see from the list of authors, this is really a group effort putting all of this together. So as part of the study, we tried to answer three main research questions. The first was to understand whether the pandemic had actually affected modality styles for non-mandatory trips. The second question was to understand and try to determine if any new modality styles had emerged as a result of the pandemic. And the third question we tried to answer is which members of the population have been maybe more affected by by the pandemic and the related policies than other members of the population in terms of their mobility and accessibility being impacted. So first, I want to start off with some background information because the title and the topic itself is relatively loaded, and there's quite a few technical terms that might not immediately be familiar to some people. So the first, I wanted to talk about non-mandatory activities. Traditionally, these are regarded as activities that are non-work and non-school related. And within the grouping of non-mandatory activities, there's kind of two main subcategories. The first is maintenance activities, which include grocery shopping, visiting doctors, going to the pharmacy, things of that nature. So these types of activities are more essential in nature because they help to meet physiological needs. And the other category of non-mandatory activities is discretionary activities, which primarily consist of social and recreational trips. And while they are not necessarily essential for survival in the sense of life and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they do help meet psychological needs that are slightly higher up on the pyramid. So amongst non-mandatory trips, the important features are, again, that they can help meet basic human needs. Particularly among seniors, non-mandatory activities have been found to be beneficial to their health and their quality of life. Non-mandatory activities often tend to be more flexible than mandatory activities in their scheduling. And given, even before the pandemic, with the rise and proliferation of information communications technology, certain non-mandatory activities can be engaged in from home. This includes, say, online grocery shopping. Obviously now with the pandemic, a lot of people are having social gatherings on Zoom. And so the reason why we wanted to focus on non-mandatory activities in this study in particular was that compared to mandatory activities, let me rephrase that. Mandatory activities tend to be more rigid in terms of their scheduling, and oftentimes you have very little say in when and where these activities can take place. So for example, work and school arrangements, there is to a certain extent a degree of flexibility, but oftentimes you are obligated to be at a certain place at a certain time for a certain part of the day. And so we wanted to look at non-mandatory activities because there's a bit more of a discretion there, there's a bit more of a flexible element. And so when you combine that with the pandemic and the associated risks and the associated policies, we thought that the pandemic would be more impactful in terms of the calculus of deciding to engage in a non-mandatory activity compared to a mandatory activity. And so with the pandemic, obviously there's reductions in travel. We've seen this in both the GTA and in other parts of the world. Part of this reduction in travel demand stems directly from government policies. In some places they have more strict restrictions like curfews or more heavily and strictly enforced policy about trips being only for mandatory purposes. In other jurisdictions, like in the GTA, it's more of a suggestion. It's more of a stay-at-home campaign type of approach where you encourage people to limit the travel as much as possible. But aside from the direct impacts of these policies, the risk associated with the pandemic and the concerns about contracting COVID-19 and the desire to try to do one's part also people maybe deciding to stay home when they could. As part of this, and in the context of travel behavior, we've seen in many jurisdictions that there's a greater preference for individual modes, which is private vehicles and walking and biking. At the same time, there's usually a reduced preference or reduced demand for public transit, for ride hailing, and for taxi. And a lot of this stems from perceptions of risk and the concerns about the potential risk of exposure to COVID-19 when you're traveling. And even as we've seen these pandemic-related restrictions relaxed a little bit, you see there's more people are more willing to return to active modes and private vehicles compared to public transit. And in certain jurisdictions, this has manifested itself in the modal shares of private vehicles and active modes returning to close to pre-pandemic levels, whereas public transit modal shares tend to still lag behind and still tend to be significantly lower than the pre-pandemic levels. So here's a chart from the Google COVID-19 mobility report for the GTA. So the lines represent the moving averages of the number of visits to, in this case, retail and recreational facilities over the course of the first wave of the pandemic. The baseline is the number of trips made on a given day of the week between January 3rd and February 6th, 2020. And as you can see, obviously, when the initial state of emergency was declared, let me just change the pointer. Sorry, I should have done this before. So you see the significant dip, which corresponded to perhaps the most uncertain period in the pandemic when we were still learning about, risk factors and potential consequences of infection. And then as the restrictions were slowly eased as we entered stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 of the reopening plan, or the previous reopening plan, you see kind of a gradual return to pre-pandemic levels of visits to retail and recreational facilities, although they still are below the values that we saw at the beginning of 2020. And we see a similar trend with visits to parks, although in this case, the fact that these values are significantly greater than the baseline mostly correspond to the fact that the baseline was defined during the winter, where visits to parks are relatively limited. But you still see the same trend where as the restrictions are eased off a little bit, people tended to visit parks more often, although part of this too could also be because of the changing seasons. Obviously, this high point here corresponds to the summer, and the increase kind of follows the increase in the average daily temperature. So the key question we wanted to answer as well is that very clearly in different jurisdictions, we've seen kind of a shift in modal preferences. And we wanted to know if this shift was a result of just people wanting to use different modes, or if it was reflective of a shift in the higher level orientation that influences their behavior. And in at least travel behavior research, this is often referred to as a lifestyle. So in the context of transportation research, lifestyles have kind of two main definitions that are interrelated but somewhat different. The first definition is that a lifestyle is reflected in the patterns of activity participation and time use. And the other definition is that lifestyles are reflective of a person's values and of behavioral orientations, which is kind of the definition we're leaning on more heavily in this study. But basically, you can kind of marry the two definitions together to say that a lifestyle is manifested in attitudes, is a manifestation of attitudes and values, and you observe them indirectly through people's patterns of behavior. And in terms of travel specifically, the lifestyle aspect pertaining to travel is referred to often as a modality style. These modality styles are believed to influence all aspects of a person's both travel and activity behavior, and that includes both short-term decisions like mode choice and location choice, and also long-term decisions like vehicle ownership and residential location choice. For modality style specifically, they're often referred to as a behavioral disposition that is reflected in the mode or set of modes that a person habitually uses. And in general, lifestyles tend to be a relatively stable construct. However, they can change as a result of life events like getting a new job or having a child, or they can also change in response to changes in values and attitudes and perceptions. And of course, with a pandemic that's happened one time in the last century, this event is surely significant enough that it could lead to a long-term change in lifestyle as a result. So in terms of measuring lifestyles, there tend to be three different approaches to try to get at and define lifestyles. Because lifestyles are a latent construct, you can never actually measure them directly. You can only kind of infer them and try to understand from the outside in based on different observable characteristics. So the most basic approach to determining a lifestyle is a socioeconomic and demographic approach. And of course, as the name suggests, this means that you kind of group people and define lifestyles in terms of people's observable personal household characteristics, things of that nature. There's the sociographic approach that kind of tries to acknowledge that because lifestyles are to a certain extent a reflection of attitudes, that you could group people and come up with lifestyle constructs in terms of people's stated attitudes towards, say, certain modes or certain types of travel. And then there's the mechanistic approach, which we applied in this study, which says that if a lifestyle is a manifestation of is manifested in a set of behaviors, then we should use those behaviors to try to determine people's lifestyles and come up with the definitions based on their observed behaviors. And so to do that, we had to obviously collect data. And in our case, those of you who attended our seminar in the fall semester know that um, Professor Habib's group, amongst us, we conducted 4 surveys to try to understand the impacts of the pandemic on different aspects of residential location choice and activity and travel behavior. So for this study, we used data from 2 separate surveys. There's the stated preference experiment on travel mode and especially transit choice behavior, or SPET, and then there's the study into the use of share modes or system. Both of these studies try to look at the impacts of the pandemic on the use of what I referred to earlier as shared modes. SPET looked specifically at the impacts of COVID-19 on the use of transit, and system looked at the impacts of COVID-19 on the use of ride-hailing, so services such as Uber, Lyft, etc. Both surveys included a comment section and then kind of diverged towards the end, obviously, to help achieve the goals of the survey. So the common sections of data amongst the 2 surveys are your basic socioeconomic and household information related to the pandemic, meaning the behaviors that the respondents were exhibiting during the pandemic, like mask wearing, adherence to social distancing guidelines, things of that nature. There's also, we asked respondents to provide us information on their typical travel behavior before the pandemic and then during the pandemic. We also asked the respondents to provide us or answer a series of attitudinal questions and questions about their perceptions, and they were asked to complete a series of stated choice experiments. So to give you a little bit of context of when the survey was administered with regards to the COVID-19 situation in the Greater Toronto area, we have this chart here, and so at the time we designed the survey, it was about late May, early June, so we had just gotten to about stage 1 of the previous reopening plan, and by the time the survey was administered, the region was in stage 2 of the reopening plan, I believe, and we were about a week or so removed from entering stage 3. And so the survey period here is just shown in dark gray, and so it was a time where that we had kind of weathered the first wave for the most part, and things were starting to look a little more optimistic. Obviously, now we know that around October or November, the second wave hit. And so this needs to be kept in mind when we're looking at the particularly the responses to the attitudinal questions, because with a situation as uncertain and as dynamic as the pandemic, there's a chance that the responses people give are based on the point in time in which a survey was conducted, which is something we need to be cognizant of. So although the 2 surveys had common sections, we had a couple of issues with merging the 2 data sets. The first was handling duplicates. Although we administered the survey to a random sample of members of a market research panel, there were a few cases where individuals had completed both surveys, so we had to come up with a method to handle that. And because of the slight variations in the manner in which the 2 surveys asked respondents to report their typical travel modes, we had to address that issue before we could start the empirical work as well. So in terms of handling duplicates, we tried to identify people who had completed both surveys based on the combination of their IP address, their reported gender, and their reported age. Ultimately, there were 183 respondents that participated in both surveys, And instead of trying to come up with a deterministic rule on how to choose which response from which survey to keep, we just eliminated both of them to eliminate that source of bias. And in terms of defining the outcome variable, the main reason this was an issue is because of the way the question was posed. So SPET had two questions. What was your primary travel mode for shopping trips? And what was your primary travel mode for other trips? And this was asked both in the context of pre-pandemic travel and travel during the pandemic. And in system, we asked what modes of transportation you typically use for non-commuting trips, so kind of a catch-all for non-mandatory trips. And respondents were allowed to select all of the modes that apply to them. Aside from the wording of the question, we also had a bit of an issue harmonizing the modes that were available to the respondents. So ultimately what we tried to do is, because system had fewer modes defined, we tried to map the SPET modes to the system modes, except for individuals who had reported that they used a motorcycle or another mode for their trips. In these cases, we just eliminated the observations because there was no analogous mode in system. And ultimately, it didn't seem to have a very large detrimental impact on the results because ultimately there were only 39 observations that had to be removed. And so as part of addressing this difference in mode definitions and to help make the sets of survey data compatible, we basically just took the two sets of results, we filtered them through the definition of modes, and we came up with 8 different binary indicators corresponding to whether the person reported using a certain mode for a certain trip in both the pre-pandemic periods and the time during the pandemic. There's also a 9th indicator that I did not show here that corresponds to individuals who reported not making non-mandatory trips, either pre-pandemic or during the pandemic. And so the chart here shows you the distribution of individuals who used modes for non-mandatory trips before and during the pandemic. As you can see here, there's a slight uptick in driving yourself. There's a pretty significant decline in public transport use as well as ride sourcing use, and slight increases in biking and active modes, which, although these don't reflect modal shares, they are kind of similar to the findings in other jurisdictions, which have shown that active modes have become a slightly more popular mode during the pandemic than before the pandemic, most likely because you're still able to maintain a certain amount of distance from others when you're traveling. And amongst those who didn't reported not making trips, as you would expect, the percentage of people who just abstained from participating in non-mandatory activities outside of their home increased. It was higher during the pandemic than it was before. Okay, so with that, now I'll go over the methodology that we use to try to analyze the modality styles and ultimately come up with our conclusions. So in the literature, modality styles are represented in there's 2 different approaches to representing modality styles. The first one is clusters, which is similar to what you would see in your typical machine learning application, where people are grouped based on the similarity in factors such as their activity participation, the frequency with which they make certain trips, the frequency with which they use certain travel modes, things of that nature. And the other approach is the latent class approach, where you either group individuals based on their observed travel behavior, which would constitute more of a latent class analysis, latent class cluster analysis, or you would group them based on heterogeneity in tastes. And what I mean by that is that certain groups of individuals may be more sensitive to travel time versus those who are less sensitive. And so among these individuals, you kind of group them together so you can capture the impacts of certain independent variables and certain aspects of the trip and of the trip makers, and you can determine how they vary across segments of the population. So in our case, we took the latent class approach to identifying and grouping individuals based on modality styles. And in particular, we use latent class cluster analysis, which is akin to traditional cluster analysis, except you're able to better mitigate the impacts of measurement error because you're able to probabilistically assign individuals to each latent class, as opposed to traditional clustering analysis, where you have to deterministically assign individuals to classes, although there are newer versions of clustering that kind of address this issue as well. So ultimately, the latent classes are defined based on the indicator variables. In our case, they're binary. And the whole idea of latent class cluster analysis is that every person has a probability of belonging to a certain latent class, and based on the class to which they belong, there is a probability that they provide a certain response to each question. So on that note, the key outputs of latent class cluster analysis are the probability that each individual belongs to each class, and conditional on the probability of them, or conditional on their belonging to a certain class, you get the probability of certain responses being given. In our case, because the indicators are binary, it would reflect the probability that a person says that they did use a certain mode compared to the probability that they did not. So here's the basic structure of how we approach the analysis. So each modality style was postulated to influence the pattern of responses given by each respondent. So here, modality styles are regarded as a latent variable, and they are, in the formulation, are believed to impact the outcomes of these indicator variables, which again are based on the questions in the survey, and more specifically the modes that each individual reported using before the pandemic and during the pandemic for non-mandatory trips. And so beginning of the formulation here, which is a little bit mathy, but basically Y represents the pattern of responses, I represents the individual, R represents the latent class, and basically for every indicator variable J, which again is represented by each of these rectangular boxes, there is a probability that the person gives a certain response, and then because this is binary, the complement is the probability that the person does not give the response. And so just for brevity here, we only report the probability that the person gives an affirmative response, which is to say that the probability that they will report using a certain mode during a certain time period for non-mandatory trips. And then based on the class conditional probability of giving a certain response, or a certain pattern of responses rather, you can find the unconditional probability by basically taking the weighted average of the probability of giving a certain response pattern multiplied by the probability of belonging to that specific class. And if this is this is kind of mathematical and conceptual, and so I thought it'd be helpful to give a more just graphical example. So for a given individual, if we're in a situation where we have, we believe there to be 3 different modality styles, and there's 4 possible modes that were included in the survey. For each person here, there's a probability that they belong to each of these 3 modality styles. And based on the modality style to which they belong, or another way of saying that is depending on the latent class to which they belong, they have a probability of reporting using a certain mode. So for example, with what we've named strict drivers, these individuals, based on the pattern of responses, would be those who always drive. For the people who belong to the eco-conscious style, there's a 50-50 chance that they will report using a bus or walking. And for people who, for lack of a better term, say live downtown in a dense area that's more transit accessible and more walkable, they are more likely to report walking for certain trips, followed by the probability of them using bus and then them taking an Uber, for example. And so because the constructs and these modality styles and latent classes are purely functions of data, we often try to name the clusters or name the modality styles based on the pattern of responses. So getting into results here, the first step in latent class cluster analysis is to determine the appropriate number of latent classes. Oftentimes this is not exactly an easy thing to do because there's no kind of clear objective way to come up with the number of classes ahead of time. And so what we usually do is that we start with the one class model and use that as a reference point, and we try to see how the fit of the model improves as we add successive classes, and to determine whether that is worth, the gain in fit is worth the additional number of parameters that come up, because for each class you also have the probabilities associated with providing each response. So every time you add an additional class, it should improve the model fit, but you sacrifice parsimony, which is kind of a reflection of the efficiency or kind of getting the most bang for your buck, as it were. So usually what's done is that you look at the Bayesian information criteria, or BIC value, associated with the number of latent classes in the model, and you also look at the G-squared statistic, which is referred to as the likelihood ratio chi-square. Traditionally in the literature, what's done, you continue to add successive classes until the reduction in the G-square value, it converges to a relatively low number. Sometimes it's roughly 3%, sometimes it's less than 5%. And at the same time, you also look at the BIC value, because this is a reflection of model fit and model parsimony, excuse me. So it penalizes your fit based on the number of parameters you have. And so in this case, for both the pre-pandemic modality styles and the pandemic modality styles, the reduction in the likelihood ratio chi-square statistic never really converged. And we observed this kind of rebound after the addition of the fifth latent class. So in both the pre-pandemic and pandemic stages, we decided to use 5 modality styles. So here is the table that I was referring to that looks at the probability of belonging to a class and a specific latent class, and the probability of providing a specific pattern of responses given that class. So as you can see here, the modality style we've named strict drivers makes up the more than half of the sample, followed by transit and auto users, pedestrians and auto users, what we've dubbed as the mobility reliant, and I'll get into that more in a bit, and multimodals. So each column corresponds to the probability that a person in a specific modality, exhibiting a specific modality style, gives a certain pattern of responses. And because the indicators are binary, these represent the probability that a person reported using a specific mode for non-mandatory trips at a certain period of time. So pre-pandemic, we had strict drivers who predominantly drive themselves for non-mandatory trips. We have what we call transit and auto users, because each of the members of this class will report using public transit, and then there's about a 1 in 3 chance that they also drive themselves for some of their non-mandatory trips. Then we have pedestrians and transit users. Again, there's each of the members of this class will say that they've walked, and then they kind of mix in public transit about half the time. We've referred to the fourth class as the mobility reliant, because they seem to rely on either being driven by someone else, or ride hailing, or ride sourcing, or taxi for their non-mandatory trips. And then we have multimodals who are just a bit all over the place, and so there's a reasonable likelihood that they'll use ride hailing, but they could also be using public transit or walking. And so this table is a bit loaded, and so I wanted to give an example here, where again, if you are a person who belongs to the pedestrians and transit users class, there is about a 48% probability that they will report using public transit for a mandatory trip before the pandemic. And so based on the probability of each individual belonging to each class, we applied sample enumeration to try to get a profile of the different latent classes and the different modality styles. So again, strict drivers are people who pretty much only drive for the non-mandatory trips. This group had the highest average age, and were also the least likely to live in Toronto, and also had the highest share of people from high-income households, which likely means that they lived in the suburbs, or the other regions that comprise the GTA, Peel, Halton, Durham, and York. There were transit and auto users. This group had the highest percentage of individuals or members who own transit passes, and the highest percentage of individuals living in Toronto, which kind of makes sense given that public transit is a lot more competitive in Toronto than it is in the rest of the GTA. There's also pedestrians and transit users, so people who maybe try to walk for most of the non-mandatory trips, but for long trips they may use public transit. And then amongst the mobility reliant, they're more likely to be students than the sample as a whole, and they are more likely to belong to lower income households. And then multimodals, as you would expect, because they seem to be fairly likely to use a variety of different modes. They tend to display relatively high levels of transit pass ownership and vehicle ownership. And for these individuals, they may be basing their choice of mode on the destination as opposed to just it being a habitual choice. So now for pandemic era modality styles, we have, again, strict drivers, which makes sense given the kind of preference for private vehicles. But we also see the emergence of some new modality styles. We have non-travelers, which corresponds to people who have abstained from participating in non-mandatory activities outside of their household. We also have pedestrians and auto users who walk primarily for their non-mandatory trip, but might also supplement that for longer trips by driving. We have here what we refer to as shared mode users and pedestrians. So these individuals seem to be using public transit for a fair amount of their non-mandatory trips, but they also supplement that with the use of ride sourcing and taxis and walking to a certain extent. Then we have the private vehicle reliant, which corresponds to individuals who either drive themselves or are driven by someone they know. And so again, we have transit and auto users, pedestrians and auto users. These individuals have the highest percentage of members who live in Toronto, which may be because on the whole, Toronto is relatively more walkable than the rest of the GTA. They also display relatively low levels of vehicle ownership. So this could mean two things. On the one hand, they may be walking when the household vehicle is being used by another member of the household, or it could mean that they tend to stick to walking for shorter trips and potentially auto for longer trips. This could also potentially be due to kind of the rise in people just going for walks during the pandemic because it's a relatively low risk way of getting out of the house and getting some exercise. And then there's the shared mode users and pedestrians. This Latent Class, this cluster had the highest share of members who are students who are still working at their usual place of work, and individuals who belong to lower income households. Among those who are private vehicle reliant, they are more likely to be relatively young, they're more likely to be students, and they display a strong preference for private vehicles, as you might expect. And among non-travelers, interestingly, they had the highest average age among the 5 classes, and they had the highest share of unemployed individuals. And so during the pandemic, we wanted to understand if there was any variation in the attitudes and perceptions across the different modality styles. So what we did was, amongst some of the attitudinal questions that were common to both surveys, we assigned a numerical value. So these questions asked respondents to indicate their level of agreement with the statements. We coded the responses corresponding to those who strongly disagreed with the statement as a 1. The 3 corresponded to people who neither agreed nor disagreed. And the highest level on the Likert scale was the strongly agree, which is represented by 5. And so just to get a rough idea of if there was any variation amongst the different modality styles, we took the average response of individuals belonging to each modality style. And so as you can see, there is a certain amount of variance across the different styles. For example, people who belong to the non-travelers class are more likely to agree that there is more risk associated with leaving their home before the pandemic compared to the other members of the other 4 modality styles. They're also they more strongly agree that they're less willing to spend time traveling within the GTA, and they tend to be more reliant on online orders because, again, an important aspect of non-mandatory trips is, say, grocery shopping because of the need to meet one's physiological needs. And so what this table kind of shows is that there are differences in perceptions, and that is potentially what could be leading individuals to belong to certain classes and as a result exhibit certain modality styles. And of course, these modality styles are reflected in travel and activity behavior. So the key takeaways from our analysis were that there was an emergence of new modality styles, particularly the pedestrians and auto users, the shared mode users and pedestrians, and the non-travelers. On these shifts, we see what's been observed in other jurisdictions, which is that there is a greater reliance on private vehicles, and on the whole, private vehicles appear to be playing a more prominent role in the mobility and accessibility of GTA residents, specifically for non-mandatory trips in this context. There also seems to be an increased prominence of walking, potentially, again, because we only asked people for, in the questions, we asked people about non-mandatory trips. We did not specify that a trip had to start in one location and end in a unique location. So it is possible that some of these individuals reported using walking because they're going for walks without any specific, without any set destination in mind, and just return home afterwards. And as which has been seen in other jurisdictions, there appears to be a decreased reliance on public transit for non-mandatory trips, although there are still individuals in the region who do rely on public transit in order to participate in non-mandatory activities away from their home. And so broadly speaking, the key takeaway for us was that the impacts of the pandemic in terms of mobility and accessibility appears to be greater for those who don't have access to a private vehicle. And what that means is that not having access to a private vehicle could mean that either you live in a household that does not own a vehicle, or that you don't have a driver's license. And so either reason why you wouldn't be able to drive or be driven by someone else would constitute being without private vehicle access. And so the implications of this result is that people who don't have private vehicle access may need to decide between using shared modes or active modes if they're not able to participate in non-mandatory activities from their own homes. And that's a bit fraught because if you use shared modes, your risk of exposure to COVID-19 is relatively higher than it would be in a private vehicle. And then there's kind of a trade-off because if you use public transit, for example, it's more affordable, but there's a greater risk of coming into contact with strangers on your trip, and there's a greater chance that you'll be traveling in a crowded vehicle. But on the other hand, if you use ride sourcing, or taxis, where you can kind of be sure that you'll only come into contact with the driver, the cost of using these modes is much higher, especially for longer trips than public transit, which obviously, at least within Toronto, is a flat rate. And even if you're traveling within the region, tends to be cheaper than a taxi or a ride sourcing trip. And then on the other hand, if you use active modes, your accessibility could be limited depending on your tolerance for how far you're willing to walk, how long you're willing to walk, things of that nature. And even with the potential use of cycling, previous research has shown that the decision to adopt cycling, particularly if you're going to cycle on roadways without dedicated infrastructure, there are certain barriers to entry. Some of them are predominantly, many of which are psychological, so they relate to attitudes and perceptions. And so for some individuals, cycling may be a non-starter because they're concerned about their safety on the roads, or there could be relatively limited access to their desired destinations depending on where they live. Although recently, I think even as recently as yesterday, there was a study out of the MIE department at U of T that found that the addition of temporary cycling infrastructure did help with this issue, which is something to keep in mind. And again, for those who are unable to drive, there is the potential for reductions in mobility and accessibility. For example, seniors who may have been reliant on public transit might have to face the decision of either switching to active modes, which will limit their mobility, or to use public transit, where the risk of exposure is higher. So these are issues to keep in mind as we continue to progress through the pandemic and hopefully come out of it by the end of this year. So in terms of public transit, based on the results, we wanted to highlight the importance of trying to strive for service that is as frequent and reliable as possible to reduce the chances of crowding. Even though ridership is obviously down, it's not. There's still been anecdotal evidence that there is crowding on vehicles in certain parts of the city. And I remember an analysis from the Toronto Star, I believe, in 2020 found that the crowding on public transit vehicles tends to occur more on routes that serve lower income neighborhoods and areas where low wage jobs are located. So that's something to keep in mind from the equity perspective as well. I'm sure other transit agencies are already doing this, but if not, it's important to leverage AFC data, so smart card data from in our case, Presto machines, to try to identify patterns of crowding and high demand and try to plan service, try to mitigate crowding. And as we all know, Toronto's somewhat not notorious, but infamous for this. The majority of the operational budget for transit agencies comes from the fare box in Toronto, I believe. Depending on the year, the operational budget is made up of, I think, roughly 60 to 80% of the operating budget in a given year is made up by fare box revenues. And so with transit ridership being down, it's important that other levels of government, or all levels of government, really step up and try to financially support transit agencies, because they are providing what amounts to a social service, particularly among those who rely on transit to make non-mandatory trips and in particular maintenance trips. And by providing financial support to the transit agencies, they can help to increase frequencies of service and reduce crowding, again, which is important not just during the pandemic, but in the recovery period as well, because based on experience from Taiwan after the SARS outbreak in 2003, building public confidence is a key to getting the ridership back up to pre-pandemic levels. And the perception of transit vehicles being crowded and relatively unsafe, we'll say, could hinder the eventual return to pre-pandemic ridership levels after the pandemic is over. And in certain cases, depending on the returns to the rebound of ridership, it may be also necessary to come up with a new ridership growth strategy that we've seen, I believe, in the 2010s that worked pretty well. And in terms of active modes, we recommend that municipalities try to reallocate space to pedestrians and cyclists, kind of what we've seen in the Active TO program in Toronto, where certain residential roadways were kind of closed off and temporary cycling infrastructure was installed to try to help make it a bit more feasible to use active modes. You could also take this one step further potentially by taking a network-based approach and trying to strategically close local roadways to facilitate walking access to parks and recreational facilities, both of which offer relatively low-risk environments for people to gather, particularly when they're outdoors. Again, you could also take what's done in the Active TO program and expand it further to try to make cycling seem a bit more feasible for people and to try to reduce the perceived barriers. And I guess it's not as timely now, but last week I was really thinking about this. Making sure that snow is cleared from sidewalks promptly, because even in the best of times, after a large snowfall, we all know the sidewalks kind of narrow a little bit, and so in a time where you're being encouraged to try to keep your distance from people, there being snow on either side of the sidewalk makes that somewhat difficult. And in the long term, so in the literature, I think it's pretty widely accepted that modality styles affect both short and long-term choices, and so changes in modality styles can have impacts on travel demand, such as congestion due to changes in modal shares. It can change the prominence of certain modes. If the trend that we're seeing now continues post-pandemic, we'll have an increase in the modal share of private vehicles and maybe a decrease in the modal share of public transit, which has implications for congestion and emissions, and unfortunately also the long-term viability of transit without external financial support. And in terms of decisions, it can also affect residential locations and car ownership. Although the uncertainty surrounding the pandemic might make some people hesitant to commit to these long-term decisions, those that have, it'll be difficult for them to reverse course if they change their minds post-pandemic, because obviously if you purchase a house or purchase a car, that often comes with a payment plan, and you're kind of locked into that choice, and that could have implications on commuting patterns down the line, especially if we're seeing people move from kind of the more dense downtown core to areas outside the city, where there's a bit more space, or those who move from, say, condos to houses, and depending on where they work, they may need to commute by car in the future, where they previously were able to commute by transit. So it's difficult to say now whether these changes will persist or what post-pandemic modality styles will look like, but it's something to monitor, because this will have policy implications and implications for the transportation network as well. So in conclusion, the pandemic seems to have resulted in changes in modality styles. Private vehicles are playing a more prominent role in mobility, while transit is playing a lesser role, but there still are individuals who rely on public transit, and so that's something to be cognizant of even amidst declining ridership, and particularly because pre-pandemic standards regarding crowding are no longer sufficient. It's important to try to account for the current context in service planning as well. And so as part of that, policy interventions, again, such as increased frequency or opening up some of the roads to make it safer for cyclists and pedestrians can help at least can help people satisfy their mobility needs without needing a private vehicle more so than they would if there were no interventions. And finally, we'll need to monitor these trends and collect more data to ultimately understand whether these changes will persist post-pandemic and to see what kind of modality styles exist once the pandemic is over. So that's all I have. I think I went over time a little bit, but thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, for the presentation. Great work, actually. Now the floor will be open for 5 minutes for questions. And then if people don't have any commitments after and they need to chat with Patrick, and if Patrick can stay, you can guys stay for longer. And you can post your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I can enable you to speak, if that's better.
Well,
Yes.
since nobody is asking any question, I would like to thank Patrick for presenting his work and such a nice presentation. And as you know, that you can always reach out to Patrick and myself for any questions you have. We're doing a series of studies related to the COVID impact.
It is. So,
Yes, Jason, I think now you can unmute yourself.
Okay, good. Yeah, very interesting, Patrick. I was just curious. So are you going, or do you intend to sort of repeat this work then during the next phase of the survey and see how those patterns change?
yeah, if nothing else, I think I want to collect similar attitudinal information to what we did in the first wave just to see if there's been any changes. And yeah, this is definitely on the table as well because it'd be interesting to tie it back to this afterwards, just given that obviously the context will have changed. I mean, people's attitudes will most likely have changed. So yeah, I think it'd be a good idea.
Yeah, because this is all data from July, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Hi, Bill. Thanks for your comment, by the way.
Yes, Bill, I think now you can unmute yourself.
No. Allow. There we are.
Yep.
No, very neat stuff. Am I coming through okay?
Pardon?
Share the video. This one wants 2. This one wants 3. There we go. Much better. Patrick, very interesting work.
Thank you.
I'm curious about your the selection of cluster analysis or latent behaviors and how it relates to traditional market research, market segmentation. So in some ways that you're building it up from the demographics of and characteristics of the individuals. Other ways you're taking it down from their stated preferences and revealed preferences. But the other place that all this kind of call it clustering of people into categories is in that classic market research area. So
absolutely.
I would find this interesting to compare with some of that work.
Yeah, I think at this point, the latent classes is kind of like an advancement onto clusters because, as I tried to touch on in the presentation, there can be kind of issues where when you deterministically assign people to one class or the other versus kind of allowing them to kind of flow between the classes.
Yeah.
Yep. And plus, it's a little more difficult to interpret the results afterwards because of everything you have to apply certain aggregation approaches, and although I think qualitatively the results would be pretty similar, you do get slight variations depending on whether you sample enumeration versus other approaches to aggregation as well.
How large were the useful sample sizes of the two surveys?
Oh, sorry, I should have mentioned this. So ultimately, the data set we used for analysis was comprised of 1,483 responses.
Wow.
The SPET survey, if I remember correctly, got about somewhere on the order of 950 useful responses, and then the system survey originally had 920, but we had to drop some of them after we found the duplicates.
Yeah. Very neat. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so the webinar is officially over, but if people have more questions, we can stay for longer if Patrick has time.
Oh yeah, I don't mind. Yeah, Emily. So I think so because I mean it would